Okay. So yeah, thanks also from me for the invitation. And yeah, as I kind of mentioned in my first comment, the first time we all met, there are institutions that we're trying to build, and there's a kind of, we're talking about addressing the current moment in a realistic way. We have to go beyond just our world. And so I'm going to kind of discuss some of the real world and art world intertwined overlaps that I deal with, and I deal with my colleague Marita Mukkonen, who co-directs Perpetuum Mobile with myself. And so I'm going to talk about Artists at Risk, which is one of our newer projects, its origins, purpose, and how it works. Then I'll be thinking a bit about, I think, real world problem, which is the Biennale, the biennial, and we can maybe all have our opinions on that. And the current, for example, is one of them, Documenta. But other biennales too are equally complicit, I think. And we have to understand how we can deal with that as art world operators, whatever we are, curators, artists, critics, and so on. And lastly, I'd like to get to the kind of the comment, which is the point I made last time we met, and how different forms of institutions of the commons might be forms of solutions to the current crisis of any kind of common approach, which I think is what is lacking in the face of very serious crises, not only in politics, which we heard today already about fascism, but also in terms of ecology, social crisis, and generally, how we approach the future, which seems quite bleak at the moment. There are no clear overarching ideas of how to approach these intersectional crises, if you like. Yeah. So the first, artists at risk. So I'm just going to paraphrase or quote the question: how can artists and art institutions provide the conditions for political liberation, economic security, and greater equality of opportunity? That was part of the question. And so just on the first kind of, this first section on Artists at Risk, I thought I'd introduce the project to you and how we approach those three kind of points that were asked in the question. So Artists at Risk is a perpetual mobilization that is a PM project, a curatorial platform which I run with Marita. And it's a new institution at the intersection of human rights and the arts. AR is dedicated to mapping the field of persecuted visual art practitioners, facilitating their safe passage from their countries of origin, which means getting them visas, organizing, their flights or their passage across various other channels of, let's say by, crossing borders, other than the usual means, and hosting them at AR Safe Havens, which is a series of residencies which we've been building, starting in Helsinki, and now we're also going to be in Berlin at Savi. We're working with Savi on a residency in Berlin, and we have one at Weising in Cambridge, and Oslo Black Theatre is part of it, Sari residence, Savstamoinen, and then Provence. And just now in the context of Documenta, but certainly independent of Documenta, we started AR Safe Haven Athens, and launched a so-called AR Pavilion there, where we exhibit some of the artists who we actually work with. So we don't actually just give them the keys or a stipend and say, go sort yourself out and you're safe, and pat ourselves on the back and say how wonderful we are. It's kind of the opposite. We are enriched by their presence. We talk about, we convince politicians and others that this is actually our honor to be hosting such great artists and curators and critics and so on from these countries. And this is an inversion of the kind of element of, condescendingly saying how we're wonderfully helping asylum seekers or refugees, and we're the usual white burden type of thinking. We're saying, no, we're enriched. And so we find in the pavilion in Athens right now, we have some really great artists. I won't go into great detail, but Issa Tolma, Pinara Granchi, and Erkan Özgün are some people you should be watching. I think they're very brilliant artists and describe the conditions in their countries in very interesting ways. Just a bit of background of Artists at Risk. So it grew out of something called the Realign Project, which is something that Marita and I founded in order to work with rebellious and revolutionary movements in different parts of the world. So we actually work with those that are most at risk because they are the most willing to stick their neck out to actually put their own lives on the line. And these include artists from Russia, from Egypt, from the Indignados in Spain, from the US, the Occupy movement, from the Balkans, from the Middle East. And if you look at the map of realign.org, .net, you'll see, it's quite extensive. And we have had to kind of help them after the fact that we just showed them as an artist. We have to make sure that they don't get sucked back in, put on trial, tortured, or even murdered. And one of the cases that many people might have heard of is the so-called singer of Tahrir Square, Rami Essam. He was a young man of 20-something when he came on stage and became then the hero of his generation, so to speak. But he was tortured by first Mubarak, then by the Muslim Brotherhood, and now by Morsi. And so we managed to facilitate his safe travel very, very close. He just made it out with, really literally took the jacket off the back of his, they actually had to bribe the last border guard with his leather jacket to get him onto the plane. So, and he then was in safe haven in Helsinki, and he's been in Sweden, now he's back with us, we're producing his album, etc., etc. So what we do is we actually curate their works, they're mainly visual artists, but then there are musicians. We currently have a filmmaker, Errol Mintaj. And so just to address the questions that you raised, the political liberation was one of them. So I think it's clear, we're actually trying to help them, not only in their struggles in their countries of origin, but also, to express themselves where they couldn't before. So it's a reaction against the repressive or authoritarian regimes which they escaped from. Political liberation. Economic security, surely giving them a breather of 3 months or a year provides them that security to continue their path and to strengthen their movements at home. So this is often, an artist from, let's say, Ramallah or from Moscow that has to have the strength to go back and fight that fight, and often they really want to. They don't want to stick here on some kind of benefits and hang out and be an artist. They want to go back and fight the fight. So I think that is something practically that we're trying to facilitate. And greater equality of opportunity, well, sure. We're trying to say also artists that have made it across the borders that Fortress Europe has put up, that once they're here, they're also integrated, or if that's the wrong word, they're put into the system and given equal opportunity to develop just as much as anyone else, which is no small feat. To actually enter the system, know how the grant system works, get to the next step, and so on. So I think if we want to talk about artists at risk in greater detail, I think we can do that, but maybe I'll address some of the other issues that we've raised today. Complicity. So how complicit is the art world in the production of capital and reproduction of forms of power which produce and sustain the conditions for political disenfranchisement as well as ever-increasing economic stratification. So what I wanted to do here is just to kind of take a very practical example, and I think you did the same, and talk, well, in this case, about a commission. So some of you might have heard, actually Bonaventure is not here, we spoke to him about this, that we've been commissioned to curate the inaugural Lagos Biennale. So now this is a kind of a weird position to be put into, where you're actually, being asked to say, well, how are you going to implement this global, very much commercial and capitalist-linked art biennale system into the global economy? And, coming from a very anti-systems type position within Europe, which is a safe position compared to many others in other parts of the world, you're in a double bind. Either you do it and you're damned, or you don't do it and you're also damned for not including a part of the world which has been excluded historically for hundreds of years through colonialism and neocolonialism. So how do you deal with that kind of problem, and what kind of complicity are you part of, and which ways can you see escaping that or somehow dealing with it? So due to the kind of radical or kind of more, let's say, young and energy of Folakundo Oshun, the artistic director, he wants to open in October. So this is a typical neoliberal kind of position we're put in. Okay, you want to do this, and you want to do this now, and you want to do it with no money. Okay, this is now, how classic is that, right? And so we're running against totally impossible financial conditions, right? We have to exploit ourselves because there's no clear discussion about fees. I mean, come on, who needs to pay rent? Because Africa comes first. It just happens to be that Nigeria is the financial capital. I mean, Lagos is the financial capital of Africa at the moment, but, art takes a kind of another role, and we have to kind of provide this kind of fluff on the top of all of that, but without being paid, which is an interesting neoliberal condition. But then think about it. This complicity is the same, if you like, for the so-called alternative scene in Berlin or in any other, Western capital, where, you're basically doing everything for free, you're working and working and working, and finally when somebody makes it somehow, they're put into some kind of a system which is maybe a non-profit system, then into a governmental system, and then gallery system takes over, and suddenly all your capital is kind of turned into real, like not from social and cultural capital, but turned into economic capital. So this is not just the predicament of the curator doing a biennale, but it's a predicament of many of the whole system. So I think we need to kind of be aware of that, and I don't think it's enough, personally, to kind of personally say, I don't want to be competitive, I want to not be competitive, I don't want to have to fight tooth and nail for every little commission and every little, bit of rent. But we are part of this dark matter, as Greg Chollet puts it, with no reference to Africa, by the way. But dark matter, he describes this, whatever it's like 70% of the universe is dark matter, and he talks about how art workers, there's so much of the art world that is not paid, not visible, that makes the art world work. And so how do we deal with this? What do we how do we talk about political liberation, economic security, and quality of opportunity in this context? Well, yes, in a sense, as I was mentioning before, there's a balancing of the playing field in the art world. So you bring forth the strength of a new center of international artistic creativity in Africa. So there is a certain form of liberation or equality. A vitalization of the local and regional art scene, which brings appreciation and funds from economic actors, so economic improvement for art. It's not retreating into identitarian notions and hence strengthening the quality of opportunity on a global level. So Fola, the Nigerian art director of the Biennale who commissioned us, says he doesn't want an African Biennale. He doesn't want it. He wants to have a global Biennale. He wants to have a universal Biennale. He wants to do something that you don't need to be, from Nigeria. You don't need to be black. You don't need to be talking about black issues. He wants to do a Biennale that addresses issues. It's called Living on the Edge. So the curators, I think, have to be part of that. But this is an interesting question. I mean, I think it's really a very kind of a progressive one, saying we want to be universal in some way or form. And of course, a generation before this, being universal was considered the worst possible thing. It's white, authoritarian, monolingual, one author, blah, blah, blah. And we have this problem that we're still kind of hung up on, this, opposition to any kind of universality. And I think this also addresses something you were talking about, uniting the left. But I would argue on the contrary, that there is a need for this, and that there is a need to address what we really do see. It is a system of capital, and it is a never-ending competition of growth and cannibalization of the planet. And if we like it or not, we're participating. So it's an argument to be re-engaged on a more universal level. And I don't know if anyone's come across it, but there's a really brilliant critique of this, of the, kind of subaltern and post-colonial theory, in which kind of, there's a radical split between the global south and the global north, whereas, that capitalism in some ways doesn't apply to India. That's a kind of very, very vulgarized form of what the subaltern group was saying. I think you should read this book. It's called Post-Colonial Theory and the Spectre of Capital by Vivek Chibber. It's been, the critique of it has been, all of the subaltern group has addressed him specifically, and he's thrashed their arguments. It's brilliant. You have to read it. And currently the topic of a heated debate. What he's trying to say is that it shows that I'll quote here, the crypto-orientalist fetishized notions of post-colonial otherness should be overcome to understand them as a universal predicament, or as I like to say in this case, mondial, globalization from below. it's a struggle. I believe the same dialectic procedure should be carried out on issues that are currently dividing us on the left. That is, gender, national identification, race and skin color, and so on. So this again addresses what Jörg was was mentioning in the political sphere. So this is now just to take a little bit of a step back, is to say, well, what kind of position are we in when we're in this kind of post-identitarian, more universal, not abstract universal, not like in the Hegelian sense, but in a practical sense, and I'll get to that in a moment. How do we deal with that? So we're trying to develop a discourse in our work, Marit and I, and one of them is to get over the idea of multiculturalism and to develop something called what we call pluriculturalism, or if you like, with a Bakhtinian twist, you could call polyculturalism, which means, I don't know if you know the work of Bakhtin. Mikhail Bakhtin was a theorist who was in Russia in the early kind of 20th century, who in some ways antedated Derrida and many others in understanding that the power of voice and the power of multiplicity within one is very important, and that you can, I'll give you an example that might make life difficult for me. If you say that I'm already a woman, right? If you say I'm already an African, I'm already a Chinese person inside, I don't have to sit next to somebody else who is not what I am and respect them and treat them as an other and how different they are, and then just kind of like nod my head in agreement that they could live in another universe. But it's to say I'm already that which is the other. And I think this type of understanding for a multicultural, the shift from multiculturalism to what we could call polyculturalism, where the cultural mix is in the self, is what is needed in a commons form. So now I've kind of promised, and I mentioned that this would go on for a little bit longer than 10 minutes, but I'll be coming to a conclusion. I promised at some point that that I would also give a practical example about what I mean by universal. And so universal, in this context, we could call the commons. What is that? So in my book, I mean, it's water, right? It's something as simple as that. There is no human being that can exist without water. And they have this problem in Lagos. At the moment, in Lagos, there's a very big drive by Western companies to privatize the water, which means that they will be paying 100 times more for a glass of water than they did before. It's something like this, right? So this is a common good which is being privatized and taken away from them. And this is the same struggle that we have been facing in Venice, which we were working on with the Sala group in Venice to oppose privatization of water in Italy, in Venice in particular. And we fought that with artistic means and actually won in the case of Venice. So these are common issues. And in the case of artists at risk, we are defending with them common rights, such as justice, equality, and solidarity, which we've discussed. And it is also, the commons is a form of assembly. Now, since, just very briefly, as we get to the end, I wanted to say that since 2011, it's become an important practice and object of study and rethinking of how we can institutionalize our resistance, is the assembly. Just recently, just now and last year, Judith Butler and Negri and Hart have published books on that topic, just assembly. So, but in 2010, the Arts Assembly is a very kind of experimental format which we developed, Perpetuum mobile, in the context of Manifesta. It was a way in which we could organize as art workers, as art practitioners, to judge the work of art in a negative positive way, but in a way which gives the artist some space and distance, but is a commons way of evaluating the work, which is not a market-based approach. And this, I can't go into the details, is in a context where we have to develop new forms of assembly today, where all national funds are showing their exhaustion, and we see the UN, which is the United Nations, showing its also total incompetence and inability to evolve. So now this is, just to finalize the idea of assembly and what we could do as artists and curators, is, I'll just read from what I wrote. It says, in a context in which a Swedish billionaire is giving 5 million euros for reimagining the global system of governance, and more to implement it, it is the work, dare I say, responsibility in the existentialist mode, of artists, curators, critics, and theorists to use their supposed creativity, imagination, freedom, and artistic license, quote unquote, to imagine alternative futures, perhaps futures which are practically impossible today, that is to say, are technically unfeasible, but that are artistically, and that is philosophically, realizable, real. Now, this is what one might call the great artistic bounty. It is what we should bring to the table, joined by groups such as GM25 and others fighting their fields of specialty in preparation for the next generation of art and life. And I think, you know, this is the kind of institutional approach I would like to see developing out of this kind of gathering that we've had here, and the Commons Assembly we've held in Brussels with the European Commons Assembly, and develop these models of institutionalization. And so I think with that as a kind of practical moment, I'll finish what I was saying. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.